what not just Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations learned from our response to Beirut 1983 to October in particular is that, hey, this works. Terrorism works. The Americans talked tough, and then they left fairly quietly in early 1984. That's exactly the model that we're going to use going forward. Use proxy forces, use terrorism, make that cost of being here so high, the cost of peace so high that we're going to control this territory. We're going to get the outcome that we want, and the U.S. is going to probably talk tough. Maybe they'll lob a few missiles every now and again, but then they're going to leave, and we're going to get the outcome that we want.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonpbc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's aditonpbc.com/FTGN-LOGE. I'm excited to announce we have our own FTGN merch store where you can rep From the Green Notebook gear with high quality shirts, hoodies, hats, water bottles, and more. We are partnering with X-Ray, a veteran-owned company, to bring you From the Green Notebook elevated performance apparel and casual gear on demand that is made right here in America. Not only will you look good wearing it, but you'll also help support the podcast. And you're going to love the quality of these shirts so much that you may decide to open a unit or team level store of your own, and you can. X-Ray offers free design services and creates dedicated web stores for units so you don't have to worry about taking orders, keeping money, or keeping an inventory on hand. Click on the link in the show notes to see our store, grab yourself a shirt, and then learn how to get your own store powered by X-Ray. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly. And this week, we're diving into the notebook of Jack Carr. Jack is a former Navy SEAL turned best-selling author of the Terminalist series. And today he's back on the show to talk about his latest book, Targeted Beirut. Jack's transition from the battlefield to the world of writing has been remarkable, blending real-world military experience and storytelling that grips readers and leaders alike. In this episode, we covered Jack's first nonfiction project, where he recounts the events surrounding the 1983 Beirut Barracks Bombing, a pivotal moment in the war on terror. We discuss why this event is still so relevant for military leaders today and how the lessons learned can then inform our current approach to conflict and strategy. Jack offers insights into the emotional toll of war on those who were there and their families, the leadership lessons from both the battlefield and Washington, and why we should study this conflict. We also touch on the writing process and the importance of understanding the weight behind national security decisions, both then and now. This is a conversation for anyone interested in the military history, leadership under fire, or just looking to gain a deeper understanding of key moments that shape the decisions of leaders today. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, Jack Carr.
What's happening, man? How are you?
Doing well. It's you're the first guest. It's come back, I guess, a few months after the last appearance. So
Nice.
awesome. And
I'm like in your library there for people that are watching, like in that library back there behind you.
yeah, I was like, I have to get this up before I talk to Jack again, because last time we had a conversation, I was sitting in an empty house, and I had to just imagine the books behind me, but now they're actually behind me now.
Yeah, looking good.
Yeah. You trying to read, see what's back there. Yeah. And I've even got to choose. I got to start figuring out like what books go behind me for these podcasts too.
When I do the one over here, I have a podcast that's it's a book club podcast now. So I have my regular podcast that's just a conversation once a month and once a week and can be anybody. But then I have a new book club one that I started in July, where I just focus on one book a month, let people know ahead of time so they can read it ahead of time, submit questions that I can ask the author when they come on, and then also partner with independent bookstores where people can get 15% off if they call, and it's there for like 2 months, the discount for the book. So it's really just a way to encourage book reading. But when I sit down, I try to, if they have multiple books, I'm like moving things around and putting their books. And this right here is mostly nonfiction, except for the Ian Fleming section over here. Then all the fiction is in the other side over there. But in this one, if the person writes thrillers or something, then I have to move a space off the shelf and put their other ones back there. And then I get busy with something else and then have to move everything. So it's like this constant shuffle getting the right books behind me if there's an author that has either books we're going to talk about or their own books behind me as we do it. So it's constant shuffling.
Yeah. Well, today I've got a copy here with all my notes in it of Targeted Beirut. And I have a shelf that's off to the right. It's off camera right now. And that's all books like I need to read, like I want to read. I just haven't got it. So I have like a whole shelf of, it's like my own library. I can just walk up to and find something I haven't picked up yet. Well,
it's important to have books that you haven't read in your library so you can go to reference, ones that you mean to read, so they're visually there. It's just important to build a library, I think.
Oh, it totally is. And we're going to ruin this podcast, Jack, because we're not actually going to talk about Targeted Beirut, but it is so important because like there's books that maybe you mentioned something to me in a conversation that I grabbed the book. And I don't have the time to read it right now, but then eventually, I may have a couple moments or I'll be at a place in my life and I'm like, oh, I need to grab this one right now. I feel like this book's speaking to me. And because it's here in the library, I'm able to do those things.
Yeah. You remember, there's a section in this book about X, Y, or Z that I need for my research for this book or for this guest podcast or whatever it is. And you're there right away instead of scrolling through something, on a digital medium or thinking, what was that book? Let me see if I can go order it or find it. No, it's all right here.
Yeah. So get your library today and start by getting Targeted Beirut. Well, let's
Good one to start with.
Yeah, let's dive into this one. And I want to, I was thinking about different places to start. I think the most important question to begin with is, you and I were both practitioners at one point. Why is this particular book an important read for military leaders serving today?
Yeah, well, it's the lessons, and it's capturing those lessons. But for me, when I started down this path into the nonfiction space, and when I was going to pitch it to Simon & Schuster, I made a list that ended up being about 3 pages long of all these different terrorist events through mostly modern history. Maybe there was a couple older ones in there, but mostly modern history. From the end of World War II, I'd say up to today. And so I made this big list, and I kept coming back to Beirut 1983. There was just so much about the year 1983 and the place Beirut, Lebanon, that was essentially a tipping point in our relationship with the Middle East. Of course, you can go back earlier. You can go back to 1979. Of course, you can go back before that. You can go back to the 50s with our relationship with Iran. So there's all sorts of different events throughout history that were pivotal. But for Beirut 1983, as a kid growing up around that time, where I'm just starting to read the same kind of books that my parents are reading, I know my path is I'm on my way into the military eventually. I'm reading the nonfiction that I can read at the time, mostly about Vietnam, of course, for a 9, 10-year-old kid back then. But reading the Nelson DeMilles and the David Morrells and Tom Clancy. He was coming out a year after this, but it was such a seminal time in our relationship with the Middle East. And of course, it's the largest single day Marine Corps loss of life since Iwo Jima in World War II. And then for me, looking at it from a strategic perspective and thinking about what decisions led to putting these Marines as peacekeepers in harm's way, and probably one of the most tactically disadvantageous position that you can put someone in. And then we saw it again in Afghanistan in August of 2021. Once again, lower level enlisted junior officers put in a tactically disadvantageous position by senior level leaders far removed from the battlefield. So there's some similarities there, but there are lessons in the pages of history, and we are not very good at learning those lessons, and then even worse at applying those lessons going forward as wisdom. So the idea is you want to learn from other people's mistakes. You're going to make plenty on your own, but you don't need to make other people's mistakes again, especially ones that have lessons learned in blood, like Beirut 1983. So that was the one that I was going to start with. And it also humanizes it, because back in 1983, there's obviously no social media. There are, of course, news agencies, print and television that are on site very soon after the event. But there wasn't a way to really humanize it that you can today. And there isn't the documentary that's out there that talks to these guys. It's not necessarily forgotten. People remember something happened back in Beirut. There was a big explosion. If you really press them, maybe some people remember there was two, one at the embassy in April and then one at the Marine Corps Barracks and Headquarters building in October. But most people have no idea. And I really didn't either until I started down this path doing the research. Between April and October, what was going on? And these guys were in combat. And the talking points for the administration were, these are peacekeepers, they are not in combat. Now that I've gotten to know some of these guys and I've sat down with them and talked to them, they were 100% in combat between April and October of 1983. So there are a lot of different lessons at the tactical level, the operational level, and then at the strategic level. So the idea was to capture those lessons, humanize the event through the people that were actually there digging through the rubble with K-bars, with a shovel if they could find one, maybe a crowbar, their bare hands trying to rescue their brothers in arms as essentially the clock ticks down on their survival. And there was just so much I didn't know about the event as someone who, I kind of thought I was pretty well in tune with different terrorist events in the 80s and 90s. And then obviously after that. But I learned so much. So the idea was the least I can do now as an author is to capture some of those lessons, to humanize the event, and then at least it is out there for future leaders.
Yeah. And, as somebody who served and, I led people, like as I'm reading, I'm putting myself in the position of the battalion commander, of, the operations officers, the folks that were on the ground. And even as they're working through the aftermath of the bombing itself, just kind of thinking like, what would I be doing? And, you do it really, you go back and forth. I think that one of the things that I love about this book, and I would encourage people to read it, is on one chapter, you'll be on the ground in Beirut talking, experiencing what the Marines are experiencing on that day. And in the very next chapter, you're going into the Situation Room in the White House where there's a meeting. And there's a, one of the parts of the book that is super heavy are the phone calls that President Reagan made to the families. And I wrote, the passage that I highlighted was that these painful conversations were the gritty byproduct of decisions made around a conference room table. And, a lot of, I think it's a great reminder for people, especially staff officers, as they go up, when you're in a combat situation, that every decision, every briefing you do, every project you work on, there's a man or woman on the ground that's going to experience that. And, hopefully, that everybody's able to walk home after the event. But I made a note next to that passage that this is the real price of national security decisions.
Yeah, and it weighed. I talked to Michael Reagan about it, and he said it weighed on his dad till the day that he died. The decision to put Marines ashore in Lebanon, and really, what you mentioned there, it comes back to there's a long line of decision makers, but the final person in that decision making chain is that E1, E2, E3, E4 with a rifle with the safety off, finger on the trigger, and that decision-making chain starts at the president of the United States and goes all the way that down. And so the end result of those policies that are dictated here in the executive branch come all the way down to this E3 standing there with, at the time, an M16 and with, let's say, a rifle. And they're the person that has to make the final decision. And that I recognized that when I was in the military. But when you read this, hopefully people will get a better understanding of that, because they'll see who Reagan is talking to, what advisors are recommending that they put Marines ashore in Lebanon, which ones are recommending that they keep those Marines on an amphib somewhere offshore, and just how these decisions got made and how it essentially devolved into chaos.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Why were the Marines there in the first place?
So a peacekeeping force, which was said over and over again. You have Beirut, Lebanon, Lebanon in particular, with all these different factions from Druze, and you have Israel in there. You have these different terrorist organizations that we don't really have a very good understanding of at the time. The one, of course, involved in the attack would evolve into Hezbollah over time. But these are the early days. And now we have, of course, Hezbollah essentially in charge of Lebanon. And you can go back and look at the pictures of Beirut, of Lebanon in like the 70s. They're awesome. Kind of like Tehran. If you look at Iran pictures in the like the 60s and early 70s, it looks awesome. It looks like such great places to visit. Now, of course, you probably don't want to spend too much time there. But it's devolving into chaos, and the Marines go essentially in there to be essentially referees. And so the whole time that they're there, the senior level leadership has to weigh these ROEs, these rules of engagement, against what the aftermath of an event will look like. Meaning, will it look like we're taking sides? And then will all of a sudden we be in the middle of this civil war as participants rather than essentially a referee? So it was not a great mission for the Marines. And why did they think they could do that? I don't know. And I think that comes across in the book too. There's some quotes in there from different lawmakers. What are we doing there? Why are Marines there? If they're not going to go and crush the enemy, what are they doing there? Just standing around as targets, essentially. So it was probably one of the most dangerous places on earth. There was even the two car bombs, one in April and one in October, that were suicide bombs, but they weren't the first car bombs. Their car bombs were essentially like a cottage industry in Beirut. There were these businesses that popped up around disarming car bombs. Usually they were parked. They weren't suicide truck bombs like in the case in October here, but there were cars parked on the street and that sort of thing. And so there was a whole industry that popped up around diffusing these things, which was interesting. I didn't know that until I got into the research for this book either. But essentially, complete chaos. Put the Marines in, expect them to solve it, and then hold the person, of course, in charge, as his military, accountable when things go awry. And in talking to Colonel Garrity, he was just put in a horrible situation. He probably would have been coming out of the Marine Corps without this event.
Yeah, it was, as they're reading, and, I was the last couple of years before I took command, I was at the operational strategic level in Afghanistan. And when you read some of the quotes in here at the national level, whether it's, Reagan or a presidential directive, like it's the same. We were saying the same things in the 80s that we were saying in the 2000s. And for me, again, this goes back to why it's important for us to study that stuff, is because those things that we're saying, those ideas that we have about being able to achieve objectives, whether it's the Middle East or somewhere else abroad, like the implications of those ideas are the human treasure of our young men and women, which is what we saw in 1983. And so it's just really interesting how, hey, if we're there refereeing, we'll be able to keep stability. We'll be able to support a government that's not really respected by the people. While meanwhile, you have these other foreign actors. A phrase that we used to talk about several years ago was, it like, when we're abroad, it's where the map sheets touch. And so, we're in Syria doing something with the Syrian Defense Forces against ISIS. Well, so is Russia over there, maybe pushing Syria, pushing Turkey. And so, that great power competition, even though it's not in Russia or not in the United States, but that's where the map sheets are touching. And that's where these great powers are coming into play. And so that's what was happening in here too, which is crazy. And you capture that. So could you talk about some of those forces that were complicating this mission at the strategic level?
Israel and Washington's relationship with Israel, Iran, of course, using proxy forces, really in a model that would prove out to be their long-term strategic plan when it comes to other countries in the Middle East. So even though the book is about Beirut, it's almost just as much about Iran if you kind of extrapolate out and look at what's happening today in the use of these proxy forces. But I think that's probably the main thing that I would take away from it, is that Iran doesn't really care about Lebanon or Beirut. And you can just look at pictures of it from, like I said, in the 60s and 70s, and then from the early 80s on to today. And especially today, there's so many parallels to what's happening, in particular in Lebanon right now, almost through no fault of their own, with Hezbollah essentially being the ruling party there, which is essentially a branch of the Quds Force of the Iranian military, essentially. So it's essentially this battleground that is, and who really suffers the most? The innocent civilians, the families that are there in this friggin' battleground, with Hezbollah launching rockets into Israel at the behest of Iran. And who's going to pay the price? People in Lebanon, people in Beirut, people specifically along that border where the rockets are being launched from. So it's essentially a buffer state that Iran does not care about, that it just has been using for decades, and we're seeing it again, and we essentially have been playing Iran's game the entire time. What not just Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations learned from our response to Beirut 1983 to October in particular is that, hey, this works. Terrorism works. The Americans talked tough, and then they left fairly quietly in early 1984. That's exactly the model that we're going to use going forward. Use proxy forces, use terrorism, make that cost of being here so high, the cost of peace so high, that we're going to control this territory. We're going to get the outcome that we want, and the U.S. is going to probably talk tough. Maybe they'll lob a few missiles every now and again, but then they're going to leave, and we're going to get the outcome that we want. So I think that big takeaway is really that we've been playing Iran's game this entire time. And if you're ever going to probably shift the paradigm in the Middle East vis-a-vis the West, then you're going to have to stop playing Iran's game. And to a large extent, Israel's been doing the same thing for almost the same amount of time, is playing a game on, and a game isn't the right word, but you understand what I'm talking about, playing Iran's game instead of their own. And of course, they'll do some things every now and again, assassinations, recent ones that we've had in the news here, both in Tehran and in Lebanon. But it's still Iran's game. It's still hitting proxy forces, even though one was in Tehran. They hit a proxy force leader essentially in Tehran. So I think that's a lesson too, is it's the same thing over and over again since the early 80s.
Over the last 4 years, I've developed a morning ritual of reading, writing, and reflection. But before I do any of that, I brew a hot cup of my favorite coffee, Alpha Coffee. They make premium 100% Arabica coffee, and Alpha has some of my favorite blends. They have Dawn Patrol, which is a nice medium light breakfast blend. I also enjoy Charlie Don't Surf, which is a medium Kona blend. And when I go to the field for training, Alpha comes with me because they also make K cups and they make instant coffee too. You've got to try their Seven Summits instant coffee. Not only do they have great coffee, they're a great veteran-owned business who has shipped over 22,000 bags of coffee to deployed troops. They also offer a 10% discount to members of the military and first responders. You can find a link to their website in the show notes, so go check them out and make Alpha Coffee part of your morning ritual and taste the Alpha difference. Yeah, and the other thing is like when you look at the arguments, which you capture in the book between the two, you got folks in Congress saying you got to stay in, you got to stay the course because what happens if we leave? And then you've got others saying like we've got to get out of here. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, sounds familiar though, right?
It does. And again, being like when you look at Afghanistan and where it was going, and even the stuff that we were doing while we were there, especially the last couple of years with ISIS and taking away their ability to conduct operations outside of Afghanistan, using that country again as a platform, then some sort of presence made sense with a very focused mission and a very focused end state. But like when you go back to this book, you can kind of see that tension in here of like, do we stay or do we go? And if we stay, what changes if we stay there? And I think you do a really good job of like showing that tension back and forth throughout while the men and women were on the ground there, dealing with all this.
Yeah, but so many parallels to our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan at those different levels, from tactical, operational to strategic. And it'll be interesting there are some books out there now, like the Afghanistan Papers by Craig Whitlock, that talks about what some senior military leaders thought personally as they were coming back from Afghanistan, and then what they said in front of Congress, and how those are almost 180 out from one another. But yeah, there's so many similarities to our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then what we're seeing obviously today in the exact same region of the world, with the exact essentially same players. It's tough. It's tough. And then you throw hostage taking in here, or into something that happens in that area of the world that the Israelis are dealing with right now. And they're trying to figure out, hey, we have precedent now of hostages being exchanged for quite a large number of senior ranking enemy commanders, essentially. And before October 7th, that's how that leadership essentially got back into place. They were in Israeli prisons, and then there was a Israeli hostage taken, and there was an exchange, and these I forget the exact number, but it was a huge number of prisoners were let go, and those were the leaders, the people who planned and led October 7th. So now Israel's in that same position. Now there's hostages again. And the precedent is, well, how many people are we going to let go, or how valuable are these hostages? We've set this precedent that hostages are extremely valuable, and we'll do anything to get them back. Okay, well, now that's the paradigm, is that a forever situation, or do you have to flip that paradigm and make taking hostages cost so much for the enemy that it is not worth it going forward? So it's a tough position to be in. And I know the logical answer, and probably the moral and ethical side of it, does line up if you extrapolate that out into what happens if you have this cost be so high for these hostages when we're talking about negotiations. But gosh, it's a tough position to be in for these leaders.
Yeah. And that was, again, that's something that this book does a really good job of especially President Reagan, kind of the, very rose-colored glasses going into it of, hey, like I couldn't believe I kept reading over and over again, world peace was, was an objective. But then as time goes on and you get the experience of losing, young service members, and, taking in the realism of the complexities of that environment, how that changes over time. And again, like, just again, the decisions that were weighing on him throughout it all,
Yeah, something I learned I didn't really realize is that President Reagan was not a fan of conflict within the executive branch, meaning behind closed doors, having his advisors kind of battle it out and present their two sides to things. I didn't realize that. I guess I hadn't really thought about it before, but it seems like a couple times there were situations where it would have been prudent to have heard both sides of this of these arguments out in a kind of a knockdown, drag out way, and then make a decision. And I guess that just wasn't his way, or at least from the research that I did for this book. That might be just a couple isolated incidents, but don't think so.
Yeah, well, diving down to the actual airport itself, who were some of the people, whether going up to the bombing or the day of, that kind of stood out to you as you were doing the research for this book, and whose stories are captured in the pages of it?
Yeah, I mean the two there's a bunch, but there are these two dentists that are they're to do root canals. And then all of a sudden, on the day of the bombing, October 23rd, they are thrust into leadership positions where they have to essentially triage this entire mass casualty event. And they were not, well, they were as prepared as they could be, but they did not expect for an entire headquarters and barracks to come down on Sunday morning when most people are asleep inside of that barracks. So them stepping up when they don't know the status of any of the leadership. They don't know what's going on. We don't have the radios and communications the way we do today. The fog of war back then, even being even thicker than it is today. And of course, they're removed from the bombings. And then there's stories like Randy Gatto, who is walking towards the barracks, and it's like, you know what, it's Sunday morning. I'm supposed to go to, I think it was in the basement, to develop some film. And he says, you know what, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. It's Sunday, everybody's sleeping in. And he turns around and goes into another building to get a cup of coffee. And that's when it's hit and comes down. And then he goes outside, and he's one of the first responders on scene there. A chaplain and a rabbi digging through the rubble for survivors. I mean, those two guys, oh my gosh, their stories. And then they're looking for another chaplain, a third, a chaplain that is in the rubble somewhere and is the last person that's found alive. Don Howell, he decided to go spend the night in the basement of this building that ends up coming down around him because there was a mortar attack, and that went down to the basement instead of going back when the alert was over. He stays down there, and ends up, after this bombing, there's somebody next to him that wasn't there before, and the guy, he's like, where'd you come from? I was on the fourth deck, and this thing explodes. And it's pitch black in there. And he ends up closing his eyes, saying the Lord's Prayer, opening his eyes and seeing a little beam of light, and then having to claw his way out. So, I mean, there's all these different stories, and then there's heartbreaking ones of the people who didn't make it. And then that recovery is just heartbreaking. The recovery efforts, trying to identify the bodies and sending a young kid essentially down into this wreckage to get the dental records that were stored there in the basement, so they can start identifying bodies on ships off the coast, bringing in the same team of forensic, essentially scientists that identified the victims at Jonestown. It's just, I mean, the whole thing is heartbreaking, but there's also hope to it. And I didn't realize that at the outset. That came later. Of course, I'm aware of the bombing. In the other room there, I have the Time magazine and the Newsweek magazine from 1983, and you're aware of it, but you're not really aware of just that human toll, and you're also not aware of everything that went in to the aftermath of that bombing, meaning what these guys did, how they essentially rose up, digging out their brothers in arms. And so the hope and resiliency really of the American servicemen really stood out to me. And it was something I hadn't really thought that much about before, because I know about the bombing, I know about Hezbollah, I know about 241 servicemen dead, that sort of thing. But then when you humanize it and think about, oh, after this thing came down, well, people didn't just stand around, and they also didn't know if there was another attack coming. They got to work rescuing their brothers in arms, and there's hope and resiliency in that as well.
Yeah, and there's a part in there it talks about, I guess, like the mass mobilization of casualty notification officers that went out, and I think it's really hard for us today to even think about, the loss of over 220 lives, in a single day, like that, and what that looks like. And, there were families, because again, this is 1983, no social media, no internet. And so, there's families just watching the nightly news, trying to catch glimpses of their sons. And there was some that even, thought their child was okay. And
Yeah.
turns out that he wasn't. And so, man, just reading that was heartbreaking. Even I think it was a company commander in there whose wife, and I believe he was an unborn son or a very young son. He ends up perishing on that day. And just how you capture that, and how that story was told in the book, again reminding us that decisions we make around a conference table have serious consequences, when it comes to war and warfare.
Yep. No, like those ones are just heartbreaking, and the families that are sitting around those TVs waiting for word, and then and then get the knock at the door. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. And we have mass casualty events, today, but 241 at a time when people are going to know, hey, my service members in Beirut. Now I'm seeing this on the news. The barracks and headquarters building is down, and you're seeing it. And then they're starting to talk about how many casualties, and then that number is going up, and they're just guesses really at the beginning. And they're just praying that their son's okay. But yeah, those ones are so tough, so tough.
And you talked about the aftermath, like for those veterans of the survivors of that event. um I want to ask you about, like, do they continue to get together? Are they still like remembering it? It's interesting. So one of those dentists, Jim Ware, I was telling my mom I'm reading the book, and she went to grade school with Jim, and she actually saw
All
him
right.
a few nights ago. And Jim was saying, I guess he ended up going on to become a commander of one of the ships that was involved in one of the, I guess, a rescue effort from a Haitian
Yeah.
earthquake, like years
Yeah.
later. And
Oh
I
yeah.
was like, man.
He stayed
But
in a long time.
yeah, but like, what happened after, like when it came to the support and everything else with amongst each other?
Yeah, they get together every year on the eve of the event. So on the 22nd, they get together, and then on the morning of the 23rd, they gather at the memorial, and read the names. And I got to be there for that, and I just stood there just listening. It was so powerful. It's totally dark out because they do it at the time of the bombing. And they read those names, and it's so powerful. And the night before, I was the speaker at the event, and just extremely humbled to be there that night, and talk about this project, and really thank them all for what they did. But it's interesting. I mean, this thing affected them, continues to impact them today, all these years later. And part of that, I think, is that they I wouldn't say forgotten about, but it certainly wasn't, because they weren't in combat, although they were most certainly in combat. Um, that they were kind of brushed to the side. They're kind of it's a hit. It's not a there's no glory to the story. I mean, there is in the rescue efforts, and the valiant rescue efforts, and the heroism of these guys digging through that rubble. But when the Marine Corps looks at it, it's a black eye. And hopefully they don't look at it like that now. Hopefully they look at this heroism, and this resiliency, and this hope, and these lessons that need to be passed on to future generations. But these guys, they get together and they're tight. Beirut Veterans of America as an organization, and that's who runs the event every year and advocates for these guys. But I talked to people who essentially they were still there in October of 1983, and all these years later, they're still back there. So it's and that's a multi-generational effect too, as we know from Iraq and Afghanistan, of guys dealing with the physical and emotional trauma of the battlefield there. But there are very few guys that were there in Beirut 1983. So there wasn't like there was this entire generation that went there like we have in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was a small group. They were there as peacekeepers, and they were put in a horrible situation, and they got hit. They lost their brothers, and they're dealing with the physical in some cases, and certainly the emotional trauma of that day, even now.
Yeah, and I remember this when I was a kid. Like I remember the bombing happening, and I've been to Lebanon since then, and I've seen the embassy grounds. Um, but yeah, I think this again, the storytelling, the way that you were able to take, this event and turn it into a story that's consumable by people today. I think it's just a great way to honor that. And you said it, something you just said, and I want to go back to something you said in our last interview. But you said like how important it is for us to dive into the lessons of this event, the thing that happened before, what happened during, and then the hope and resilience after the fact. And the last interview we had, and it stuck with me, was it, we were members of it. It wasn't called the career of arms. It was called the profession of arms.
Mhm.
And this idea that it's incumbent on all of us, which, this is why it's so important. One of our missions at From the Green Notebook is to introduce authors, introduce this idea that like you have to study your craft in the military, because you could be one of those staff officers sitting around a conference table making a recommendation somewhere, or bringing up a major flaw in the plan. And if you don't have the background in the area of operations you're operating, or you don't, understand the history of a conflict, then you're doing the men and women on the ground a huge disservice.
Yep, it's our responsibility as leaders and operators to be the best we can possibly be. And that means diving into the pages of history so we can take those lessons and apply them going forward as wisdom. And here's right here, people that are watching, they can see right here. So I know your copy doesn't have that because you have the galley. These just came, these are the hardcovers.
Okay, awesome.
And so that's that's Dr. John Hudson. That's who you were talking about earlier,
Yes.
right here. And then here we go. There's Jimmy Ware right there, and there's Gil Bigelow right there. Those two dentists that we talked about that had to step up in the wake of this. And and the photos, it was interesting doing the photos because so much time has passed. And when you're doing photos, you just can't grab a photo and put it in a book. You have to get permission to use it. You have to pay for it, do all those sorts of things. But whoever took a lot of the pictures back then, the company had been sold so many times that they didn't even know who owned the rights to the photos. And so I'm just like, I want to pay someone to put these in the book. And we couldn't even figure out who owned the photos. Marine Corps just puts like originally owned by so-and-so, and they leave it at that. But that just opened, you can't really do that in a book. But here's the president right there.
Wow.
So,
caskets.
Yeah. So the photos are powerful as well. And there's two photo sections here. But I just want to try to capture most like a lot of the feelings behind what the guys had to deal with on the ground, and try to get those photos in here and try to paint as good of a picture as possible. There's the Rabbi Reznikov that we talked about him right there, one of the first responders.
Yeah.
So you have a rabbi
and that's the yarmulke that the priest made that he cut out of like a pair of BDUs.
Yeah, exactly. It's in the Chaplain Museum. There's a Chaplain Museum, and it's in there.
Wow.
Right. But I mean, these just powerful photos, the president taking the call. So it's it was a really emotional book to write. I kind of thought didn't think about that at the outset, how emotional it was going to be. but it ended up being quite emotional, and I think it is to read as well.
How I'm curious now, like, because obviously, I can tell that you were moved by this project. Like, how is it? How do you think has it changed you at all? Um,
I mean, I'm fairly aware of having, I'm a student of history. I'm certainly not a historian. That's why I wrote this with James Scott, who is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and an actual historian. I'm a student of history. I always have been a student of history. I'm a student of what I do now, which is write. I'm a student of warfare. I was and continue to be. Um, but everything that we do changes us in a little bit. It's part of our experience. It becomes part of your experience and becomes part of that foundation upon which you continue to build. So this is similar to that, and that it was a moving experience. I learned a lot. It is now a part of me going forward. So, but just like anything else in life, it just becomes a part of you. So it was an honor to do it. That's for sure. To have these guys trust us with the with this story. And to be and of course we sent it out to all the different Beirut veterans, anybody we could possibly find, sent it to them ahead of time, the galley copy like you have. Tried to talk to as many as we possibly could, incorporate as many stories as we possibly could. But really, it's their story. That's the important part of this. This is not my book. This is not James Scott's book. This is a book of these guys who were there on the ground that had to deal with this. This is their story. So when we started this project, our job was to get out of the way, was to talk to these guys, to bring those stories on board, to weave them into this narrative that tried to capture these lessons at these three different levels. But really, it's their stories, and not mine. So for me, it was just kind of an honor to be not kind of it was an honor to be kind of a vessel for those stories, to be able to put them out there and then capture them for future generations.
well, I guess one final question for you, Jack, is like, we talked about military leaders, but I guess just for average Americans, especially, folks like my age and younger that were kids and folks that, maybe weren't even born for 9/11. What do you hope they get by picking up this book and reading it?
Well, the one part is that respect for the resiliency of the American service member, who, when put into harm's way and put into these tactically disadvantageous positions, very similar to Abbey Gate. When you see or you talk to people that were either there or that were involved in some of those debriefs that saw some of the video from Abbey Gate. And what you hear when I hear people talk about that is very similar to kind of the sentiment that I get talking to these guys, meaning they were at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan during the withdrawal. It's chaos, and you have lower level enlisted, and then you have some junior officers out there when this bomb goes off. And what happens? Well, no one runs away. No, they run to the sound of the guns, and their rescue efforts. They're helping their buddies. They're helping the wounded civilians. They run to the sound of the guns. And same thing here. Huge explosion, mass casualty event, wounded everywhere, bodies everywhere, limbs everywhere. And the American serviceman gets up, runs to that rubble, and starts digging through for their buddy, for that person to their right and left. So just that's not gone. We see it here in 1983. We see it at Abbey Gate in August of 2021. So there's that brotherhood and that camaraderie and that devotion to duty to the person to your right and left, regardless of what's happening at senior level leader, whatever's happening at that strategic level, doesn't matter. It matters what you're doing on the ground there, people to your right and left, and that hasn't changed. And sadly, the decisions made at those senior level leaders with those senior levels also hasn't changed very much, as we have seen over the last couple decades as well. So, yeah, I guess that would be it. Like the resiliency, the American service member is alive and well.
That's pretty powerful. Well, Jack, thanks for your time. This was like I said, is someone who served. Like, when you start reading it, you start putting yourself in the position of Colonel Garrity, and what happens in the aftermath. How he immediately has, he's got the rescue efforts going on, but he's also got folks establishing security, reestablishing the perimeter when he's just lost, he's almost his entire organization. And you can't help but put yourself in the minds of each of these people as you go through the chapter. And then hopefully for those who may one day be a senior level leader, they can read about the decisions that were made in the conversations that were happening and maybe take a different option, in the future. So Jack, thanks again for your book. Huge. It's funny. A lot of people have come up to me since we did the podcast, and they've blamed me for their James Reese addiction. So,
nice. Love hearing that.
So hopefully everyone picks this one up as well. So thanks again, man, for the time again today.
No, I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll link up in person one of these days soon.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Yeah, you take care.
You too. Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud. There's